So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time today going back over the plot. Obviously, you did your assessment for me, not the first week before half term, obviously the week before that. And it was clear that some of you were getting a little bit confused about who is interrogated when. And obviously, in an inspector calls, it's important to know who is interrogated when, because it all builds up, okay? So what I want you to do is copy this down into your book for me, and I'm going to explain it as we go through. So this is a tension graph for an inspector calls, okay? And the reason that it's important to know who is interrogated when is because it all feeds into the tension of the play. So at the beginning, obviously, as expected, the tension is quite low. There is a certain unease, though, hinted at the prior to the inspector's arrival. So you'll remember that Sheila said, yes, except last summer for when you never came near me. So this is something that we call foreshadowing, and basically that means that there's a suggestion made earlier on in the play of something that happens later on. So obviously we find out later on that Gerald cheated on her that summer. But that suggests that there is a certain level of tension between Gerald and Sheila before the inspector even arrives, okay? The next tension point is when the inspector arrives, and that's when tension begins to build, okay? The first person to be interrogated is Mr. Berlin, okay? Lots of you got that wrong on the assessment, and I'm not sure whether that's just because you hadn't paid attention to the lessons or whether it was because you were confused and you were thinking about Act 2 because that was the one that we'd looked at most recently. However, it is Mr. Berlin who is interrogated first. And obviously the reason that he is interrogated first is because he is the man of the house. So obviously, you know, he is considered to be the most important. But it's also because he was the one who started off this succession of events that happened in Eva Smith's life. So it's really important to know that he's the first person who was interrogated. And obviously his part was that he had her fired because she asked for a pay rise. Yeah? So number one, Mr. Berlin. Then the interrogation of Sheila comes. And again, some of you had got this wrong despite us very clearly spending a couple of lessons on it, okay? Sheila's interrogation comes after Mr. Berlin's, and the reason that it comes after Mr. Berlin's is because that was the next job that Eva had. So all of this is the points in Eva's life. It's a progression of Eva, okay? And obviously Sheila very clearly knows what she did wrong. So she had Eva fired from Millwards because she was jealous of her, okay? Then the inspector enters. So obviously this is once Sheila recognises that Gerald knows something and he tries to hide it. That's at the end of Act 1. And then obviously the beginning of Act 2 is when the inspector says, you know, I obviously know that you knew her. So that's when Gerald's interrogation happens. So Gerald is interrogated number 3, okay? And obviously that's when we find out that Gerald kept Eva as a mistress. Now lots of you had put that he had an affair with Daisy Renton, which is correct for Gerald. Gerald did have an affair because he had another girlfriend. Eric didn't have an affair. Eric slept with Eva. He was having a relationship with Eva. Okay, it's very important to know the difference. An affair is you cheating on someone. Having a relationship with someone is not cheating on them. Okay, so just be careful when you're writing details like that in assessment pieces, because a lot of you would put like that Eric was having an affair with her, and that's not true. Okay, so Gerald obviously was the one having an affair. He kept her as a mistress. Okay, so a mistress is somebody who has a partner, has another partner, so is cheating, okay, and they essentially pay for that person to live. So he obviously gave her the flat of his friends, he paid her a little money. It's not prostitution as such because he's not just going to her to have sex. That's kind of the difference between prostitutes and mistresses. Prostitutes, you literally do just pay them and go and have sex with them, whereas mistresses, obviously, you keep them. They're essentially a part of your existence. They're like a secondary wife, yeah? So again, it's really important to understand that there's a difference. So that was Gerald's involvement. He obviously had her as his mistress and then let her go. Then it is Mrs. Berlin. So number 4 is Mrs. Berlin. And again, I was surprised at how many of you couldn't remember Mrs. Berlin's involvement. Mrs. Berlin turns Eva away. So once Gerald gets rid of Eva, Eva then meets Eric, and Eric obviously gets her pregnant. but Mrs. Berlin doesn't realise that it's Eric. So she comes in and uses the name Mrs. Berlin, which gets Mrs. Berlin's back up. And then that's why she refuses her, because she's angry about her using the name, not because of the situation that she's in. And obviously here at the end of Act 2 is where the dramatic device is used. Again, I had very clearly explained what a dramatic device was in the lesson, so it proves to me that you either weren't listening or you don't care. But anyway, the dramatic device that is used is dramatic irony. So Mrs. Berlin is sounding off. She is going on about how the father of the child should be made responsible. He should be made a public affair. He shouldn't be made to take responsibility for his actions. We and Sheila know that Eric is the father of the baby. So Sheila's going, "Mother, be quiet, stop." And obviously Mrs. Berlin keeps going. And that is dramatic irony, where we, the audience, know more than the characters do. So we know Eric is the father of the baby. Mrs. Berlin doesn't. She's making an idiot of herself on stage. We know that information. So it's called dramatic irony. And I really don't want to have this conversation again, because I know I explained it in a lesson. Okay? So Eric then enters, which is this pinnacle point right here, where the dramatic irony is at its highest, because Mrs. Berlin is still going on. And then number 5 is Eric's interrogation. Okay, so Eric is the last person to be interrogated. Okay, so Eric obviously slept with Eva. Yes, so they did not have an affair. Eric was not betrothed to anyone else. He just slept with Eva. There's 2 things that we learn about Eric from this. So Eric forces his way into Eva's house. So he's had a drink and he forces his way into the house. So although it's not directly stated, there's a little bit of sexual abuse that goes on there, okay? She didn't want him to come in, he forces his way in, so he takes what he wants. Secondly, we then learned that Eric stole from his father's company to support Eva. And again, it shows us his immoral qualities. He's willing to steal from his family business to look after a girl he's got pregnant through his own stupidity, okay? And obviously, when Eva finds out that he's stealing, that's when she turns him away. So there are 5 interrogations. That is the order that they go in. Then this is where tension is obviously almost at its highest point. So the inspector's final speech. That's when he talks about if they don't fix the problems, it will end in fire, blood and anguish. So basically, it's going to end up in war if people don't solve these issues of social responsibility. And he also says that even though one Eva Smith is dead, there's millions and millions more of them out there who will be impacted in the same way if you don't change your ways. So that's his kind of final moral lesson, the inspector's final speech. Then the inspector leaves, okay? And then this is when Gerald suggests that no such inspector exists, okay? And that's when they all start to question whether they were all involved with the same girl. So they start to point out that they never saw, only one person at a time saw the picture, and he could have been passing out different pictures. She obviously had different names. That could have been different people. They all just assume it's about the same girl because of the way that the investigation is held. And then also they obviously hear that there are no suicide cases received by the infirmary. So again, the tension seems to be going down. But then right at the end, we have the telephone ringing and we have that the girl has died and that an inspector is coming. So tension-wise, there's this big build-up, then there's a slight drop, and then straight back up to high tension. But it's really important for you to understand the organisation of the events, because we've only studied plot and character in this. We have to come back to it after we've done a bit of poetry, and you have to understand the key quotations. You have to be able to explain this in an essay. And if you don't know the order of the events, then you're going to struggle. And I have given you more than enough information to learn these events. So what I'm offering you is the opportunity to spend 2 lessons now getting your head around this. So I would suggest one of these lessons needs to be spent focusing on this, making sure you've got a clear plot guide written in your book. And please don't think that I'm not going to check your books when you come back, because I am going to check it. There's no reason for why you shouldn't have been working during this lockdown. So your books will be checked, and if you've not done any work, I'll set it as homework for you to do. This is GCSE content. I made it very obvious before you left for Christmas that it needed to be done. Okay? So spend a lesson having a look at this, creating your own plot diagram, plot tension graph, so you know exactly what happens when. Then the next lesson you're going to spend on the next task. So as we've moved through each of the scenes, I've asked you quite often to think about characters, to think about how they're changing, to think about how they respond. So you should be really confident with the characters and how they change. So what I want you to do is I want you to character trace each of the main characters and tell me how they change throughout the play. Now, some of them, like the older generation, so Mr. Berlin and Mrs. Berlin, there won't be much change to show, but you can write about the events that occur that prove that they don't change. However, for people like Sheila and Eric and Gerald, there are clear changes that occur in each act, and it is your job to find out those changes, okay? So one lesson is to be spent revising the plot. You need to know that off by heart. The second lesson is to be spent doing this, so the character activity. So there's an example on the next slide from Mr. Berlin. My expectation is that you should have a character profile for Mr. Berlin, Mrs. Berlin, Eric Berlin, Sheila Berlin, and Gerald Croft. So this is the sort of layout that I'm looking for, okay? So I want you to first of all tell me who it is you're looking at. So this one's for Mr. Berlin. I want to know what happens in each act and what we learn about that character, okay? So for example, in Act 1, Mr. Berlin is very self-confident. He often speaks about himself and what he believes in, and even when the inspector tells him his involvement, he refuses to take any responsibility. So I've summarised his part in Act 1. Then you're going to think about Act 2. So this is where your tension graph is going to be really useful, because if you've forgotten what happens in Act 2, you can go back to it and you can see who's been interrogated, and then you can think about how Mr. Berlin responds during that scene. And the same for Act 3. So you can go back to your tension graph and you can have a think about how Mr. Berlin is portrayed. So this is exactly what I'm looking for every one of the main characters. So just to confirm, that is Mr. Berlin, Mrs. Berlin, Sheila Berlin, Eric Berlin, and Gerald Croft. Those are my expectations. I think I've been more than generous in giving you 2 lessons to do this. Obviously, the plot is not going to take you all lesson, so you do have a chance to get 1 character in. It is your job to organise your time though. This needs to be finished by the end of the week. Thank you very much. Make sure you complete the Show My Homework quizzes.